In the consciousness of Americans across the country, two dates are constants: September 11th and December 7th. But fewer know the dates of June 21st, July 25th, September 10th, July 23rd, April 20th, July 6th, and May 8th. However, even fewer know the date August 4th, 1850. On this day, New York City police beat and killed two striking tailors, maiming dozens more. These two men were the first known workers to be killed during a strike. Many more would follow. The 1850 New York tailors' strike was not an isolated incident. It is estimated that, not counting poor workplace conditions that led to deaths, somewhere around 1,500 workers have been killed through anti-worker and anti-striker violence in the United States, though the true number is likely much, much higher. The very first recorded strike in North American history was the Polish Craftsmen strike of 1619. The Polish skilled craftsmen that John Smith had selected for the Virginia Company's incursion into the New World were denied the right to vote, with the fact that they weren't of English descent being cited as the reason. Later that year, the Virginia Company yielded to the Poles' demands and gave them the right to vote. The next major strike was the Indentured servants plot, which took place in 1661, where indentured servants withheld their work for better food provisions. Another form of labor movement occurred throughout the American colonies during this time: slave revolts. One of the largest and most notable was the Stono Rebellion in September of 1739, where a group of slaves, ultimately numbering around 80, began marching from South Carolina towards Spanish-controlled Florida. On their way, they killed slave owners and burned their plantations, who had for so long held them in incredibly inhumane conditions. However, the slave-owning governor of South Carolina, William Bull, gathered a force of about 100 slave owners to put down the slave revolt. Near the Edisto River, South Carolina, the two groups met and fought a pitched battle in which 47 freedom-seeking slaves were killed, with 23 slaveholders killed. The heads of the killed slaves were cut off and placed on pikes along major roads in the region, who may consider escaping. The remaining escaped slaves fought the slaveholders again a week later, with most of them being captured, and who were also executed or sold off to plantations in the Caribbean. The nature of 17th, 18th, and early 19th century labor environments led to a significant lack of unity among workers, as a large majority of them were farmers who owned both the materials needed to create the wealth and the wealth itself, therefore creating no conflict. Those who didn't were well-paid master craftsmen. The only two groups of workers that had a chance to show unity, and were the first two groups to do so, were slaves and apprentice craftsmen. Multiple examples of slave uprisings and other attempts to gain freedom exist, although none were so successful as to totally end the practice, until the instability of postbellum America created the conditions that incentivized northern politicians to finally do so. The second group, apprentice craftsmen, were underpaid, and work was hard to find in cities dense with similarly hungry for work craftsmen. Some small-scale strikes occurred in the first few decades of the life of the United States, but none were widespread, and none gathered much attention. This was true until the apprentice leather workers of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania formed the Federal Society of Journeyman Cordwainers, who fought for higher and more stable wages. In 1805, the society struck for higher wages, although the leaders of the strike were soon arrested and charged with a conspiracy. In the landmark case of Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Pullis, an important precedent was formed that stood for the next 4 decades. Unions were considered illegal conspiracies. The defendants were found guilty of, quote, a combination to raise their wages. As more and more workers began moving from farm work to factory or construction trades, the traditional hours of farm work stayed, working from sunrise to sunset. This was incredibly hard on these workers, with little to no free time given. Because of this, a more general feeling became apparent, none more so than in the cities of Boston, Massachusetts, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Although unions had been named illegal, strikes had not. Although, despite this, many were still convicted with various charges, all because they had gone on strike. Both cities, Boston and Philadelphia, had seen journeyman laborers strike multiple times, as had happened during the events leading up to the Commonwealth versus Pullis decision, though none of the strikes were successful. In Boston, in 1835, multiple groups of laborers had gone on strike, led most notably by the journeyman carpenters and an up-and-coming orator to take the lead, Seth Luther. Luther had grown up in a heavily religious family in New England, where he himself gave sermons. However, he was soon expelled from the church for his staunch advocacy of workers' rights. He had grown up to become an excellent public speaker, although he himself was also a carpenter. Luther and the others who had been elected as leaders of the strike quickly set to work writing and creating a pamphlet to be spread around the city, known as the Boston Circular. In it, they advocated for a 10-hour workday, saying, quote, "We have been too long subjected to the odious, cruel, unjust, and tyrannical system which compels the operative mechanic to exhaust his physical and mental powers." The strike in Boston was ultimately defeated, but it did inspire the people of Philadelphia to do the same. This began with the coal haulers who worked on the Schuylkill River, who were led by a man who carried a sword, threatening to cut down anybody who would break the strike. This group of coal miners dumped 75 boatfuls of coal into the Schuylkill River, being among the first acts of labor militancy in the United States. After these coal miners had gone on strike, it spread across the city, from the leather workers to city employees, carpenters and printers, dock workers and bakers. Nearly all the trades within the city of Philadelphia went on strike. This immediate halt to all progress caused the city to quickly accept the workers' demands of a 10-hour workday and the raising of women workers' wages. The first general strike in U.S. history, the 1835 Philadelphia General Strike, would go on to have major effects on the future of American labor struggle. The workers learned that strikes work, and with the landmark case Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus Hunt declaring unions were legal, unions would make a resurgence, this time in much greater numbers. The businessmen learned that workers who knew they had more power were dangerous, and that if they wanted to keep their spoils, blood would need to be shed. Peaceably if we can, forcibly if we must. Such were the words of Boston carpenter and orator Seth Luther when he became a leading member of a group in Rhode Island who would campaign for non-landowners' right to vote. These words would apply to everything he sought to change. When members of the Rhode Island legislature created their own, quote, People's Convention in order to pass these laws, the governor of Rhode Island called for federal soldiers to break up these gatherings. However, many of the militiamen of Rhode Island had just been given the right to vote by this group, and so many of them stood with the People's Convention instead of the government. This group of state militia and other supporters of the convention then attempted to storm the Providence Arsenal, but this quickly failed, and soon, so had the convention. The state legislature, now in fear of a revolt if these voting laws were not passed, voted to allow all native-born men, regardless of race, to vote. Not complete suffrage, but a step in the right direction. In New York City, in the year of 1850, union activity among craftsmen was at an all-time high up to that point, and it was increasing. Success stories such as the Philadelphia General Strike had inspired the tailors of New York City to also go on strike, in search of better working conditions. The journeymen tailors of New York had among the worst material conditions in the city, besides those who had no job. Overworked and underpaid by master tailors, they went on strike. Upon hearing that some tailors were working for less than their proposed minimum price, the strikers went to the homes of these scabs to stop them from doing so. Upon arriving, they were met by the New York City Municipal Police Force, who, unprovoked, attacked the crowd with their clubs. Another group, mostly made up of the city's German tailors, went to a different tailor that was selling below scale, and who met the same fate. 2 of these German tailors were killed in the beatings, the first known American workers to be killed while striking. "14 years later, during the American Civil War, the iron and steel industries were in full bloom because of the war effort. In particular, iron mines in Michigan's Upper Peninsula caused record highs in profit for the Cleveland Iron Mining Company, or CIMC. Knowing this, the miners in the Marquette Iron Range went on strike for higher pay as a result of the increased profits, and were successful. The dock workers who transferred the iron from the land to the ships saw the success, and then went on strike themselves. However, for whatever reason, the owners decided this was not the same as the miners, and so they called on the government for federal troops to put down the strike. The USS Michigan, a U.S. Navy warship on patrol for Confederates who had been hijacking boats on the Great Lakes, responded, and traveled to the docks of the Marquette Iron Range, defeating the strike. After the end of the war, the CIMC lowered the wages of all their employees, which was initially accepted by the Marquette miners. However, the dock workers, who had not had their wages raised during the war, refused this change and kept their wages at what they had been. This time, the dock workers inspired the miners, who soon went out on strike as well. The company refused to acknowledge this strike, resulting in 2,000 iron miners marching together, dismantling company equipment. 2 days later, the USS Michigan returned, this time on a routine patrol for Confederates attempting to continue the war. However, finding the strike, the captain of the USS Michigan, Francis Rowe, also requested by the owners to do so, decided he would be the one to put down this strike. He built an armored train armed with cannons and towed it to the camp where the striking miners were staying. This ended the strike. After the USS Michigan left, the miners went back on strike and, at the request of CIMC owners, the Michigan returned, along with a U.S. Army regiment who again put down the strike. During the mid to late 19th century, no state had a stronger labor movement than Pennsylvania. A major part of this were the Irish immigrants who had immigrated to the United States, mostly due to the Irish potato famine. Among these immigrants, a secret society arose, the Molly Maguires. This society attempted to get mine and rail owners to submit to workers, and, as anti-worker violence increased, they also reciprocated against the mine bosses. In 1869, one of the shafts of the Avondale mine in Avondale, Pennsylvania caught fire. Caused by poor ventilation and careless design, the fire originated from a furnace located in the mine. The mine only had one exit and one source of ventilation. All 110 of the anthracite miners that were in the mine at the time were killed. The owners of the Avondale mine had repeatedly refused to fix any of the issues that had caused this tragedy. This event bolstered membership of the Molly Maguires and Working Men's Benevolent Association, a union. As the bodies of the victims of the Avondale mine disaster were carried out, John Siney, the president of the WBA, said, quote, "Do not longer consent to die like rats in a trap, for those who have no more interest in you than in the pick you dig with." Over one 7-year period in Schuylkill County alone, 566 miners were killed. Mine bosses repeatedly ordered the killing and beating of workers who were suspected of joining the WBA, the Molly Maguires, or the Ancient Order of Hibernians, a related society of the Molly Maguires. In the extremely early morning of December 10, 1875, more than 30 masked men broke into the home of one suspected Maguire, shot him 18 times, and burned his body. His brother was hung from a tree outside, although he miraculously survived. His wife was beaten. His 9 months pregnant sister was shot multiple times and killed. This attack was orchestrated by the mine bosses and the agents of the Pinkerton Detective Agency that they had hired to smoke out the Union and the Mollies. It is thought that this attack was to cause Jack Kehoe, leader of the Molly Maguires and relative of the victims, to commit an act that he and the other Mollies would be tried for. However, Kehoe would not be arrested, not this year at least. Although the mine bosses, led by Franklin B. Gowen, president of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, who owned the mines, would not let their plan fail. They slandered the names of those who had died in the newspapers which they owned, and of course, they murdered more miners. Leading up to these events, the WBA had organized a strike in the mines of the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company, which had lasted 7 months. Through this time, the miners and their families were killed, beaten, and starved by Pinkerton agents and the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Police. Through all of this, support of the Mollies increased in the anthracite coal fields, and an underlying sympathy began to develop between workers from all across the nation. Leading up to the year 1877, distrust of rail and coal barons increased. First, the Credit Mobilier scandal, where the Union Pacific Railroad Company executives, who were charged with building the eastern portion of the First Transcontinental Railroad, created a fake company, Credit Mobilier, to subcontract the work out to. Credit Mobilier falsely charged Union Pacific with much higher construction costs than were realistic, who then passed on the costs to the federal government and in turn to the American taxpayer. All this came to light in 1872. The workers of the United States had also grown distrustful and resentful of businessmen and private banks when the myth of infinite economic expansion caused the U.S. economy to fail in the Panic of 1873. The long strike of 1875 began when Franklin B. Gowen lowered wages to nearly half of what they had been in 1869. For 7 months, the workers of the WBA held out, but as starvation took its toll and the governor of Pennsylvania ordered militia into the region, the strike died, as did the WBA. In early 1877, the Molly Maguires were at their strongest. Their movement was growing and they were beginning to be taken more seriously, but they had a mole. Gowen had hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency to send a spy into the Molly Maguires in order to take them down. When 10 of the Mollies were arrested, Franklin B. Gowen, the same man who was president of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, was named prosecutor by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Ultimately, on testimony relying solely on Gowen and the spy, James McParland, 10 Molly Maguires were hanged in the spring of 1877. The Avondale mine disaster, the Panic of 1873, the Credit Mobilier scandal, the lowering of wages despite record profits, the hanging of the Molly Maguires, and of course, personal experiences of rampant anti-union violence set up a perfect opportunity for a nationwide railroad strike. This, of course, is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 would see the largest use of military and police action to put down strikes as had been ever seen before in the United States. Beginning in Martinsburg, West Virginia, workers of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad had gone on strike after the third pay cut in the same year. When the governor of West Virginia had called in the state militia to put down the strike and were ordered to fire on strikers, they refused. This is allegedly where a militia officer shouted, quote, "We may be militiamen, but we are workmen first." Instead, the governor called on federal troops to do what the militia had refused to, and they did. As the strike spread to Baltimore, Maryland, strikers refused to let trains leave their rail yards. State militia fired into crowds and fought their way to the trains and to the stations, killing 12 civilians and wounding more than 40. In New York, militia forced trains through picket lines. Spreading further, the strike found its way to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. On July 19, 1877, the Pennsylvania Railroad announced that it would start using doubleheaders for all trains headed through Pittsburgh. A doubleheader is 2 locomotives hauling 2 trains worth of cars. This method increased the workload on the crew, reduced the amount of available jobs, and was far more dangerous than a normal train. It would also double what was considered a day's work, setting up for an even higher workload for their employees and the firing of half of them. This, all on top of the 10% wage reduction that had occurred the month before. The Baltimore and Ohio pay cuts that had affected Martinsburg and Baltimore also affected the workers in Pittsburgh. On July 19th, one crew refused to work their doubleheader through Pittsburgh. Led by a single conductor named Ryan, the crew told their bosses that they would not drive the train. When the bosses searched for replacements, they all refused. The boss went through 25 men, all refusing to replace Ryan and his crew. The 25 men and Ryan's crew were all fired. All 28 of them then traveled to the railroad stockyards, gaining the support of all the workers there, and proceeded to halt rail traffic throughout the city. David Watt, a representative of the PRR, proceeded to request the mayor of Pittsburgh for men to put down the strike. The mayor provided the men, though having the company pay for them. This private police force, led by Watt, proceeded to the 28th Street crossing to begin undermining the strike. Watt ordered one of his men to operate a switch in order to put a locomotive onto the correct track, but when the man refused, Watt did so himself. However, he was stopped by a striker who was soon arrested by the company men. Watts' group, having little to no effect on the strike, then went to the Allegheny County Sheriff, R.C. Fife, who ordered the strikers to disperse, and telegraphed a message to the governor of Pennsylvania requesting National Guardsmen to put down the strike. The governor obliged, calling up 2 regiments of guardsmen to suppress it, the 14th and the 18th Regiments of the Pennsylvania National Guard. Although they were severely under strength, as many of them had refused to come out of solidarity with the striking workers. These troops arrived on July 20th, and, with them by his side, Sheriff Fife again ordered the strikers to disperse. They refused, pointing out any violence occurring would be caused by the militia, and saying, quote, "Bring us a loaf of bread." General Albert Pearson, in command of the guardsmen, assured the crowd he would murder them in order to protect the interests of the Pennsylvania Railroad, saying, quote, "You that know me, know that I will obey orders. I have troops who will obey my orders, and I tell you, gentlemen, these trains must go through. My troops will have no blank ammunition." Throughout the day, more workers of the PRR and the B&OR, who heard of the strike, traveled to Pittsburgh to join it. By late in the day, the strikers had given their list of demands to the PRR, demanding the ceasing of doubleheaders, the rolling back of wage cuts, rehiring of those who had been fired, and the abolishment of the wage scale used in the company. The company never responded. "Have no further talk with them," said Robert Pitcairn, superintendent of the PRR. 2 more units of guardsmen were called up, this time from Philadelphia. 600 men were sent, along with the hopes that the two cities' rivalry would spur a more aggressive reaction from the militia. They brought 2 Gatling guns with them. Each man was given 20 rounds of ammunition. Arriving on July 21st at around 1:30 p.m., they soon set out, along with the sheriff and his deputies, to decimate the strike. They were ordered to first take the outer depot of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which had been occupied by strikers, and arrest their leaders. They were soon also joined by a battery of artillery. As the National Guardsmen worked their way through the streets, they ruthlessly beat the strikers, who then responded with rocks. When some strikers attempted to stop the beating of another by wresting a musket from a guardsman, a shot rang out from the militia. Soon, a full volley was released by the unit, whose firing into the crowd continued for 10 minutes. 20 people were killed, with at least 29 wounded, including children. Angered by this, the strikers, now joined by other working men of the city, stole guns from factories, armories, and gun stores, and burned the rail yards owned by the PRR. Some of the soldiers who had participated in the earlier shooting had then went to the train roundhouse at the depot. A crowd of strikers now gathered in the same area. An artillery piece left by one of the local units of the National Guard had been left just outside, giving the guardsmen within the roundhouse their own justification that they should shoot at the crowd. 15 more strikers were killed during this. The strikers soon retaliated, firing back at the guardsmen within the roundhouse. In addition, in an attempt to stop them from firing, the strikers brought railcars full of flammable material and set the roundhouse on fire. The soldiers, in an orderly fashion, abandoned the roundhouse and then fought their way out of the city, killing many more civilians, many who were not themselves strikers. Violence died down as the hours of the night proceeded, but looting of the abandoned railcars commenced. However, as told by the U.S. Labor Commissioner during the investigations, much of the burning and some of the looting was prompted by representatives of the railroads, who destroyed their own property so that they could then claim damages and be paid by the county. Throughout the 22nd, looting and burning continued, as strikers from the neighboring city of Allegheny seized telegraphs and railroads, even managing to seize passenger trains themselves, with the intention of hurting the company and not their neighbors. Miners from northern Pennsylvania arrived on the 23rd with the intention of stopping the abuses of the soldiers on the working men of the city. They were met by a militia that had been organized by the wealthy inhabitants of the city, who forced them to return home. On the 28th, as things were returning to normal, with none of the strikers' demands met, the governor came to Pittsburgh with more militiamen, 14 pieces of artillery, and 2 companies of the United States Army to make sure the strike didn't resume. 53 civilians were killed, with 109 wounded, though it is likely that this number is much higher due to many hiding their injuries so they would not be arrested, though this did not stop 139 strikers from being arrested. While the strikes were beginning in Pittsburgh, they were similarly beginning in St. Louis, Missouri. On July 22nd, 3 meetings were held to plan to demand an increase in railroad workers' wages, and strike if this demand was not met. The first was a private one among the strike's leaders. Second, a public meeting was held, featuring speakers from the Working Men's Party of America and many spectators. The third, later that night, featured exclusively railroad workers within Turner's Hall. This meeting resulted in the following statement. Quote, "Whereas the United States government has allied itself on the side of capital and against labor, therefore, resolved that we, the Working Men's Party of the United States, heartily sympathize with the employees of all the railroads in the country who are attempting to secure just and equitable reward for their labor. Resolved, that we will stand by them in this most righteous struggle of labor against robbery and oppression, through good and evil report, to the end of the struggle. The United States Working Men's Party." End quote. Later that night, the demands were presented to the companies who operated in St. Louis, but they immediately denied their request, and so the strike began. It was announced that all passenger and mail trains would be allowed through, in addition to feed for the farm animals of the surrounding area, but no freight was to be passed through the city. Workers at locomotive shops around the city noted that they would not strike, although they ceased working out of solidarity with their fellow workers. Many workers from throughout the railroad industry soon joined. However, on July 24th, the crowd became frightened as word had spread that 6 companies of the U.S. Army infantry were on their way. However, the Secretary of War, George McCrary, refused to let them put down the strike and only, quote, "to protect United States property." Because of this, the strike was largely unaffected. These troops arrived within the next day. On July 25th, large crowds gathered, composed of other industry workers who began striking along with the railroad workers. They marched around town, getting much of the city's workforce to go on strike, with the only exception being the workers of the Laclede Gas Company, who had successfully gotten a pay raise from their employer during the strike. General Andrew Smith organized a group called the Citizens Organization for the Protection of Property, though there is little to no evidence of any destruction of property. This organization was mostly made up of the wealthy and upper middle class of the city, reaching a size of 10,000. A chair factory and lumber yard burned and was blamed on the strikers, though there is no evidence to prove it. This became a justifying reason for the sheriff to raise even more armed men to, quote, keep the peace. On the morning of July 27th, the Union Depot, which was being used as the headquarters of the strikers, was attacked by 400 federal troops. They arrested many strikers and ended their interference with freight trains. Seeing this, a large crowd of over 2,000 had gathered. A few hours later, they were charged by 50 mounted police, 500 members of the Citizens Organization for the Protection of Property, and 2 companies of the Missouri National Guard. More arrests occurred, and many were injured. The local government then offered to use these forces to force strikers back to work to many companies throughout the city. The Workingmen's Party attempted to hold other meetings, but all these failed, with one being broken up by the St. Louis police. Parades of federal troops were used to intimidate strikers back to work, as the strike began losing steam, and many going back to work, demoralized by the failures of strikes across the country. In Scranton, Pennsylvania, mine companies had also reduced wages. In 2 isolated incidents, workers of the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad and employees of the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company went on strike on July 24th in search of increased wages. The mayor of Scranton asked the population to, quote, abstain from all excited discussion of the prominent question of the day. The mayor of Scranton, with no justification whatsoever, raised a group of 116 special police named the Scranton Citizens Corps. The mayor then convinced the railroad union to go back to work with the same wages, though the miners refused to return to work. Mayor McCune threatened the miners with the Citizens Corps, though the miners still did not return to work. The governor of Pennsylvania traveled to Scranton with militiamen and soldiers of the U.S. Army. The miners still refused. On August 1st, the miners gathered near the city's iron mills. The mayor arrived and once again attempted to have them return to work. They refused and attacked him. The Scranton Citizens Corps, who soon arrived on the scene, fired thrice into the crowd, killing 4 and wounding 50. The same National Guardsmen who, days earlier, had murdered over 50 civilians were diverted to Scranton and imposed martial law. Those that had been arrested were forced at gunpoint to repair railroad lines that had been damaged earlier in the day. The strike eventually broke down, and those who continued the strike were fired. 22 of the Citizens Corps were arrested for manslaughter, although all were acquitted, with the entire unit later being promoted to a position in the National Guard as the 13th Regiment. In the aftermath, 2 men were charged with libel for criticizing W. Scranton, the owner of the mines that had been struck at, over his actions during the massacre. The city of Reading, Pennsylvania had grown as large as it had owing to its vital position between the coal fields of northern Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, where the coal would be sent and ultimately distributed. This made Reading incredibly reliant on the rail industry, exemplified through the existence of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad and the riches of Franklin B. Gowen. Reading, Pennsylvania was nearly completely controlled by the railroad, with its largest businesses owned by the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad Company, and undoubtedly the city's leadership in their pockets. In the years prior to 1877, the railroad had successfully suppressed any union or strike activity in the city, although, in early 1877, a strike had occurred led by the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen. When this occurred, the company informed all members of the Brotherhood that they could either leave the union or be fired and blacklisted from employment in any of their own businesses, which at that point in Reading was nearly all of them. Over 400 workers opted to be fired. While unrest was building throughout the country in July, Reading remained relatively calm until July 22nd, when a rail car full of shingles was set on fire. The incredible mistreatment of railroad workers and the city as a whole by the railroad led to this spreading, with more rail freight and property burned later in the day. Upon hearing that militia from Philadelphia was gathering to be deployed to the strikes in the western part of the state, they also burned the Lebanon Valley Railroad Bridge, which crossed the Schuylkill River, along with the damaging of telegraph lines throughout the area. The local police attempted to form a force of citizens to suppress this, but all who were asked refused. On the 23rd, as more trains arrived in the city, they began to block rail traffic as well. Seeing that some were getting through, they began ripping up track in addition to dumping coal on the tracks. John Wooten, manager of the railroad, directly contacted General Frank Reeder of Allentown, Pennsylvania, and requested he come and suppress the strikers. Later in the day, the railroad's private police force, the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Police, arrived, followed by the 4th Regiment, the requested National Guard unit. They were met with representatives from the company and were requested to remove a train which was stopped by the strikers in the 7th Street Railroad cut. As they proceeded, they were pelted with rocks from the streets above the railroad cut. Eventually, one of the guardsmen fired his musket, leading to a full volley being fired into the crowd, first into the one at the end of the railroad cut, and then into the crowd that was overlooking them. People were shot down indiscriminately, ending with 15 dead and nearly 50 wounded, many of whom had no part in any of it. On the day after, more National Guardsmen arrived in the city, the 16th Regiment of the Pennsylvania National Guard. Being from the industrial suburb of Conshohocken, Pennsylvania, their sympathies lie more with the people of Reading than the guardsmen who killed them, and so they began openly fraternizing with them, even declaring that should there be more bloodshed, the 16th Regiment would defend the people of Reading. The night following the shooting, both units of guardsmen went into the same railroad cut in order to protect those who were repairing the tracks. Eventually, being taunted by the gathering crowds, members of the 4th Regiment aimed their muskets. However, the 16th Regiment then aimed their muskets at the 4th, threatening to shoot them if any in the crowd were injured. The situation eventually cooled and both regiments marched out of the city separately, but the 4th was called back again. However, they refused to return. That same night, the 1st United States Artillery arrived, with 4 pieces of artillery. They occupied the rail depot and, along with the Coal and Iron Police, set to repairing the railroad. Not much would be gained from the strike in Reading, besides a new mentality, leading to much of the town soon sympathizing with the plight of strikers across the country. With the strike spreading even further, it found its way into Chicago. In preparation, the city had armed their police force with muskets and had raised an artillery company to put down any strikes that would take place. Despite this, the workers still struck. Mostly organized by the Working Men's Party of the United States, they occupied the rail yards and gathered in crowds in the street to protest their mistreatment. However, police and militia beat and shot them throughout the city. The largest of these confrontations took place near the Halsted Street Viaduct. A large crowd had gathered there, and a group of police were sent to break them up. Upon seeing the police, the crowd turned and ran. However, without provocation, the police chased after them and began firing into their backs with their revolvers. Angered by this, the crowd turned and charged the police. For over 30 minutes, the police fired into the crowd, only stopping when they had run out of ammunition. Once the bridge was lowered behind them, the United States cavalry and more police charged across and into the crowd, beating them with clubs, trampling them with horses, and cutting them down with cavalry sabers. In Chicago, 30 civilians were killed and hundreds injured. Back in Pennsylvania, this time in the city of Shamokin, another city on the rise because of its geography. Shamokin had suffered immensely because of Franklin Gowen's greed during the long strike of 1875. They had been starved and beaten by the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company. Because of this, Shamokin remained extremely labor conscious over the next 2 years. As strikes broke out across the country, miners in the area surrounding Shamokin had starved. Gowen had created living conditions so reprehensible that a huge crowd gathered at Shamokin's coal breaker demanding work or food from anybody who would listen. When nobody listened, they came back the next day, this time in the center of the city. Eventually, negotiations began for work, doing street cleaning for the wealthy. After some back and forth, the rate was set at $1 per day between a small committee on behalf of the miners and the city. This was not nearly enough to sustain the families that many of these miners had, and seeing how unsympathetic the city or company was, began marching through the streets demanding food or work. As again, the company did nothing, the crowd began swarming the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad Depot, stealing goods, almost entirely food. As the crowd continued down the road, they were met by a citizen militia gathered by the mayor of Shamokin, William Doughty, who just so happened to be the manager of the town's coal mines. Doughty also played a very large role in the suppression and subsequent executions of the Molly Maguires. This militia, made up of the town's upper class, fired into the crowd of miners seeking food or work, killing 2 and wounding 14. Neither of the 2 who were killed had even played a part in the day's events, simply being bystanders to it. One in the midst of closing his candy store for the day, and the other a man walking down the street. 5 men were convicted of burglary and were sentenced to between 3 and 8 months in prison. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 is one of the most important events in America's labor history. It was one of the only times that nationwide class consciousness had developed, and is also one of the most blatant examples of anti-worker violence in U.S. history. It was also the beginning of an era where pro-worker organizations, such as the Workingmen's Party of the United States, took root. One such example was the Knights of Labor. It was one of the first nationwide unions that served every occupation, every person, regardless of race or gender. However, the Knights of Labor generally unionized higher skilled jobs. This discrepancy became greater in the final years of the Union. The Knights were the first successful national union, being founded in 1869, with membership increasing following the strikes of 1877. On February 16, 1886, a man named C.A. Hall turned up to work as he did every day. He came in, did his work on the train cars at the Union Pacific shops in Marshall, Texas, and went home every day. He had just attended a meeting for the Knights of Labor the day before, but he wasn't very familiar with them. He had read about them in the papers and was invited by his fellow workers to one of their meetings. On that day, February 16, 1886, C.A. Hall was fired. In just days, more than 200,000 workers in Texas, Arkansas, Illinois, Kansas, and Missouri would be striking out of solidarity. In 1885, District Assembly No. 101 of the Knights of Labor negotiated a contract with Jay Gould's Union Pacific Railway that, quote, no man should be discharged without due notice and investigation. 1 year later, C.A. Hall was fired, and so the Great Southwest Railroad strike had begun. Immediately, strikebreakers had been hired by Gould to render the strike useless, and hired Pinkerton agents to infiltrate the unions. Throughout the strike, workers would disable trains, set fire to yards, and drain the boilers of stationary locomotives. Another tactic was to completely cool the engine of a steam locomotive, which required an hours-long process to sufficiently and safely heat up again. On March 19th, officials from the Union Pacific Railroad, the governors of Kansas and Missouri, and officials from the Knights of Labor would meet, but an agreement would not be reached. Throughout the strike, gathering workers were suppressed and beaten by strikebreakers, police, and Pinkerton agents. In St. Louis, 6 were killed when strikers attempting to stop a train were confronted by deputy sheriffs. Jay Gould would end up requesting that the states where the strikes took place mobilize militia to stop it. Texas called up its state militia and the Texas Rangers, and Missouri called up its state militia. Violence committed by railroad officials and the militia continued throughout the strike. As strikers began to fight back, public opinion turned against them, and the strike began to crumble. Infiltrated, threatened, killed, and beaten, many returned to work for fear of their lives. The strike officially ended on May 4, 1886. The Knights of Labor were declining, there was no question, but a new replacement seemed on the rise, formed by former Knights themselves, the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions. The very same day the Great Southwest Railroad strike was ending, another, even more influential event occurred in Chicago, Illinois. The FOTLU was attempting to make the 8-hour workday standard throughout the U.S., and this demand had been extremely central even during the early days of unionization in Chicago. It was still no different, with the same demands being made in 1886. The FOTLU had set May 1, 1886 as the day that the 8-hour workday would become the standard, and began preparing for a nationwide general strike. On that Saturday, workers across the country gathered in huge crowds to demand the 8-hour workday. Estimates put the number around 500,000 workers nationwide. However, in Chicago alone, the number was 40,000, with even more non-strikers coming out of support, with a total number exceeding 80,000. On March 3rd, speeches by notable socialist August Spies were well attended, and, as the workday drew to a close, a group of workers went to attempt to convince strikebreakers to join the strike. Police fired into these workers, killing between 2 and 6, and wounding several. Immediately, a gathering was planned for the next day, with flyers distributed throughout the city advertising the event. Although the first batch featured the line, "Working men, arm yourselves and appear in full force," August Spies, the man who had spoken earlier in the day, declined to appear unless those words were taken out, and so they were, and all but a few of the first batch of flyers were destroyed. Confederate soldier turned socialist journalist Albert Parson and English labor activist Reverend Samuel Fielden were invited to speak along with Spies in the Haymarket, a busy produce market in Chicago's west side. On the evening of May 4th, as rain-filled clouds threatened the event, Spies was the first to speak to the crowd of an estimated 2,000. A large group of policemen looked on. Quote, There seems to prevail the opinion in some quarters that this meeting has been called for the purpose of inaugurating a riot. Hence, these warlike preparations on the part of so-called law and order. However, let me tell you at the beginning that this meeting has not been called for any such purpose. The object of this meeting is to explain the general situation of the 8-hour movement and to throw light upon various incidents in connection with it." End quote. Parsons then commenced his speech. He spoke for nearly an hour, with the crowd remaining calm. The mayor of Chicago, who had been in attendance thus far, had noted how peaceful it was and hurried home, wanting to avoid the oncoming rain. Parsons, also wanting to avoid the precipitation, traveled down the street to Zeff's Hall to get a drink. As the drizzle began, Reverend Fielden began his brief speech to a dwindling crowd. As he was finishing his speech, even more police arrived and began ordering the crowd to disperse. Although giving an initial verbal fight, Fielden gave up and got off the wagon being used as a stage. As he did this, an explosion rocked the square, a few feet in front of the police line. It is unclear how many died from the initial explosion, but what is known is that both police and attendees of the rally were injured, and immediately after the explosion, the police began firing indiscriminately into the crowd, who soon dispersed. At least 4 of the crowd were killed and 70 wounded, with 8 police ultimately dying, with others injured. In an anonymous interview, a Chicago police official would reveal that a majority of the deaths and woundings of Chicago policemen were cases of friendly fire in the dark night, as it was approximately 10:30 p.m. at the time. It is also known that the bomb was thrown from the other side of the police line from the crowd. However, following the incident, many of the misconceptions and outright lies about the Haymarket Affair would arise. Newspapers, most notably the New York Times, lied that the bomb came from inside the crowd, that the speeches of Spies, Parsons, and Fielden had encouraged the crowd to enact violence, and even that Fielden had taken out a pistol and began firing at the police, which was blatantly untrue. As a result of the spreading of such rumors, public opinion quickly shifted against labor movements and the idea of unions. It also fostered anti-immigrant and mostly anti-German sentiment, as a sizable proportion of the crowd was of German descent. Very soon, police raids were being carried out on the homes of known socialists, union leaders, and those who mingled with them. They ransacked their places of meeting and intimidated their newspapers. For over a month, a miniature Red Scare swept through Chicago, subsequently affecting the entire United States and even the world. Within the labor community, the Knights of Labor were quick to disassociate themselves from figures such as Spies, Parsons, and Fielden. Many workers believed the bomb to have come from Pinkerton agents hired by the business magnates of Chicago because of their habit of infiltrating and sabotaging labor movements, though this was not proven. In the days following the event, over 100 were arrested in connection with the event, although 8 remained at the forefront. Among them were Spies, Parsons, and Fielder. Throughout the trial, Judge Joseph Gary was extremely hostile towards all 8 defendants. Nearly 1,000 jurors were called, but having so much as attended a union meeting got jurors dismissed. Ultimately, a bailiff was appointed to handpick jurors. This bailiff specifically selected jurors who were likely to convict. Evidence was slim to none, and extremely unlikely connections were used throughout. Police Captain Michael Shack led the investigation and used one main piece of evidence. Bomb-making equipment found in one of the defendant's apartments allegedly matched a piece of shrapnel found in the leg of a policeman. Captain Shack would later be dismissed from the police force for having fabricated evidence relating to the case. It was clear that from the beginning, none of the 8 men were supposed to be acquitted. An example was going to be made. On August 20th, 1886, all but one of the defendants were found guilty and sentenced to death. 2 of them would have their sentence commuted to life in prison, and 1 would commit suicide in prison. The remaining 4, including Spies and Parsons, were hanged on November 11th, 1887. Family members who traveled to witness the executions were arrested. Spies' last words were, quote, "The time will come when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you strangled today." The Knights of Labor, already declining, attempted another strike, this time in the sugar plantations of Louisiana. Throughout the postbellum period in the South, black people continued to live in conditions much the same as slavery, whether it be through peonage slavery, convict labor, or just plain unethical working conditions. In the early 1880s, wages within the sugar industry throughout Louisiana were reduced. Company scrip was introduced instead of real pay, which played a large part in the Knights' attempt to unionize the workforce. In the the wake of the 1877 railroad strikes, Duncan F. Kenner, one of the richest plantation owners in the world, organized the Louisiana Sugar Producers Association, which encompassed 200 of the largest plantation owners in the state. The LSPA lobbied the government for the passage of legislation that would suppress workers, keep the endless cycle of debt peonage intact, and research that would benefit crop yield. They also set standards of pay so that no matter where you went in the Louisiana sugar market, there was never a better opportunity. Extremely notably, they withheld 80% of the workers' pay until the harvest season, locking them in place until the end of the year. As the use of convict labor rose, the state government continually sided with the planter class, as, most of the time, these people were one and the same. In 1887, right as the harvesting season was about to begin, the local chapter of the Knights of Labor presented the planters with demands of increased wages, a halt to the proportioning of a worker's pay to the end of the year, and that payment come in the form of official currency rather than company scrip. The planters denied it. On November 1st, 10,000 sugar workers began their strike. Immediately, the LSPA requested Louisiana Governor Samuel McHenry, also a sugar planter, to send in the state militia. He did so. 10 companies of infantry and an artillery battery were sent to the area around Thibodaux, Louisiana, led by ex-Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard. False accounts circulated by racist newspapers reported mass violence committed by the majority black strikers, though none of this occurred. District Judge Tailor, another plantation owner, formed a paramilitary group of 300 white men to, quote, police the area. No black people were allowed within the city limits of Thibodaux unless they had a pass. Soon after, the mass violence against black plantation workers and union organizers began. Killed by paramilitary groups, militia, or vigilantes, nearly 50 are known to have been killed. Buried in mass graves with no denotation, their identities were mostly lost to history. The majority black farm laborers of the South would not be significantly organized again until the 1940s. The unsuccessful end to the Great Southwest Railroad strike, the public's sudden aversion to anything labor because of the reporting surrounding the Haymarket Affair, and the abject failure of the Louisiana sugar organizing led to the collapse of the Knights of Labor, who were also suffering from factionalism within the organization. Because of this, the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions would reorganize and become the American Federation of Labor. In 1888, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad workers went on strike. Like the many years prior, they sought higher pay. As the weeks marched onward, only 2% of the company's trainmen remained on the job. However, with the use of strikebreakers, the company soon had more. As they saw this occurring, the strikers contacted railroad union members in the surrounding area working for different companies, asking them to stop hauling Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy stock. This too had a great effect on the company, but Charles E. Perkins, president of the railroad, went to court and had the government force these union members to haul CB&P stock. This, along with the usual methods of intimidation and strikebreakers, put the nail in the coffin, with the strike ending with none of their demands given. 1890 marked a very important date in the history of labor, as the United Mine Workers, later the United Mine Workers of America, was founded. Sprouting out of the collapsing Knights of Labor, the UMWA would become one of the most influential forces in U.S. labor history. The next year, in the mining town of Morewood, Pennsylvania, the UMW would organize one of its first strikes, inspiring the employees of Henry Clay Frick to strike for higher pay and the 8-hour workday. As the strike grew longer, families of the miners who lived in company towns were evicted by Frick's mine company. See, as mining became a primary industry during the Industrial Revolution, coal companies would often set up their own towns, their own stores, where every piece of property in the town was owned by the company. Union members and strikers would be evicted, as were the families of miners who were killed on the job. The company would pay in a currency called scrip, which held no real value unless used at the company's store, where prices would be greatly inflated. In Morewood, just as it was across the Appalachian coal mining community, company towns continued to suppress workers. With these evictions and the lack of food, the strikers organized a march in the town, complete with a band to lead the way. This crowd reached the company store when it was fired into by militia members who had been deputized by the county sheriff, killing 9 and wounding many others. After Reconstruction ended, there was no force in the South to enforce any semblance of equality between black people and white. One of the most major ways Southern states did this was by first passing sundown laws, which made all sorts of ridiculous things illegal for black people, getting its name because most of them were based on things being illegal after sunset. The next step was leasing the now convicts to companies throughout the South, which meant cheaper labor for the companies and new ways to subjugate black people for the state government. Throughout Tennessee in 1890, coal miners across the state demanded the abolition of company scrip and the use of third-party checkweighman, basically decided how much a miner's daily work was worth. However, both company scrip and company checkweighman had already been deemed illegal in the state of Tennessee, so most of the companies accepted these demands. However, one did not. The Tennessee Coal Mining Company, operating in the area of Coal Creek, rejected these demands and ceased operation of the mine. The company said they would reopen if the miners signed yellow dog contracts, which stated that they would not be allowed to join a union if they want to remain employed with the company. The miners refused. On July 5, 1891, TCMC brought in convict laborers to reopen the mine. They also tore down the houses of some miners in order to erect a small fort to place the convict laborers in. That night, 300 armed miners stormed the stockade and took it without a fight, sending the convict laborers on a train to Knoxville. These miners then sent a telegram to the governor of Tennessee, John Buchanan, who claimed to be an ally of labor, and requested his intervention. Buchanan instead took 3 companies of militia and personally escorted the convict laborers back to Coal Creek. Confronting the governor at a place called Thistle Switch, Buchanan said that he was their ally, but he was bound to the laws of Tennessee. The miners then pointed out that he had not bothered to enforce the laws when it had been transgressions against the workers. The governor left a group of 100 militiamen to guard the stockade. However, the night after he left, nearly 2,000 armed miners again surrounded the fort. The militia surrendered, and they, along with the convict laborers, were again sent back to Knoxville. The miners then marched to the neighboring mine owned by the Knoxville Iron Company, who also used convict labor, and sent them to Knoxville as well. The governor again returned, this time with more militia, and this time met with members of the community to negotiate. They decided on a 60-day truce where the governor would call a special session of the Tennessee State Assembly to debate the topic of convict labor. However, 41 days later, and after the legislature did nothing but declare interfering with the convict leasing system a crime and gave the governor all powers necessary to enforce this, the miners still held out hope, as there was a case in the state courts that was arguing that the conditions the convict laborers were working in were completely inhumane. The Tennessee State Supreme Court ruled against the convict laborers and, in turn, the miners. On October 28, 1891, the committee who represented the miners notified the governor of their resignation, denounced the state legislature, and issued a call to arms to miners across the area. 3 days later, on October 31st, the miners burned both stockades, looted company stores, and freed many of the convict laborers, providing them with food, shelter, and civilian clothing. A few days later, however, another truce was negotiated and militia was brought in, along with more convict laborers. With such a large force of militia now on the scene, it was practically impossible for the miners to make any more major moves, although violence, instigated by the militiamen, led to more deaths over the next year. In August of 1892, violence erupted again, more convicts being freed and more stockades burned. Following this, a massive sweep of Tennessee was made, arresting anyone with ties to unions. This effectively ended the Coal Creek War. When the state's convict leasing contract ran out in 1895, they declined to sign a new one, instead using these convicts to mine coal directly for the state instead of for companies. In Idaho, in the 19th century, its largest, most profitable business was by far that of silver and gold mining. In the years preceding 1892, pay had been docked for the silver and gold miners in the region surrounding Coeur d'Alene, with the workday being lengthened from 9 to 10 hours and a 7-day work week in place. In 1892, the miners went on strike, demanding fewer hours and increased pay, specifically $3.50 per day for every person who worked underground. As soon as the strike began, mine owners in the area hired strikebreakers, many of who were from out of state and who had no knowledge of the strike. Each train of strikebreakers had armed guards on board, and who were often confronted by armed miners. However, many of the strikebreakers who arrived did not want to work because of the strike, so soon, every train into the town carried strikebreakers. Things were initially going somewhat well for the miners, but this soon changed as the mine owners began hiring private detectives from the Pinkerton and Thiel detective agencies. One Pinkerton, named Charles Syringo, had worked for the gem mine for some time, and was a union member previously. However, during the strike, he turned scab and began informing the Pinkertons, and in turn, the mine bosses, of the union's activities. He was also elected the local union secretary, giving him access to every single one of the union's documents. Due to this, many of the miners' strategies failed, as the mine owners were already aware of them before they occurred. Early in July, one miner was beaten to death by mine guards who were escorting strikebreakers. Throughout the strike, many others were severely beaten. In the early morning hours of July 11, 1892, hundreds of armed miners gathered in the hills surrounding the Frisco mine. Firing into the air in an attempt to scare the guards and strikebreakers out of the mine's mill, they were soon fired at by the mine guards, who knew beforehand what was going on due to information provided by Syringo. As the firefight continued, the strikers rolled dynamite down the mill's water channel, destroying its water wheel. The strikebreakers in the mill soon surrendered, with the mine guards retreating. They then moved on to the gem mine, where the mine guards and strikebreakers were even more well prepared, as the battle continued. However, the mine's management ordered their men to surrender out of fear of their property being destroyed, as it had been at Frisco. The surrendered strikebreakers and mine guards were sent first to the Union Hall, then to the train station, where they were told to leave the county and not return. As the Union had been suspicious of a spy within their ranks for some time, they'd finally found out a few days earlier that it was in fact their secretary, Charles Syringo. While the battle at the Frisco mine was taking place, Union miners went to Syringo's house to confront him, though he escaped by cutting a hole in his floor and running beneath a dirty wooden boardwalk. He then fled into the hills. That night, 500 strikers traveled to Bunker Hill Mine and placed a ton's worth of dynamite below the mine's mill. In the morning, they demanded that the ownership fire all of its strikebreakers or have the mill blown up. The company fired its strikebreakers. Overall, 4 Union members were killed during the strike and many more wounded, with 2 company men being killed. As the governor of Idaho declared martial law and companies of the Idaho National Guard were called in, over 600 Union members were detained with no charges, held in cow pens. Only after most of the strikers were held in these cow pens did Syringo come out of the mountains, and he began identifying Union members to be arrested, saying, quote, "I was kept busy for the next week or so putting unruly cattle in the bullpen." He then fled to Denver, Colorado. 18 Union members identified by Syringo were arrested and convicted, with most of them being overturned in the U.S. Supreme Court years later. As a result of the conflict at Coeur d'Alene, the Western Federation of Miners was formed in 1893, becoming a major force in labor in subsequent years, and later being one of the founding parties of the IWW. As the processes of steel production were improved, and especially the U.S. Navy began the construction of heavily armored ships, Steel Ventures became a major employer in the U.S., very famously in the city and surrounding area of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Homestead, a suburb of Pittsburgh, was home to one of Andrew Carnegie's famous steel plants. Due to successful strikes in 1882 and 1889, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers held a strong grip on operations in the Homestead plant, which the union saw to improving, demanding, and receiving upgraded, safer equipment for their members. However, Carnegie Steel used this as an excuse to lower their wages in 1892 by half, causing high tension between the company and its workers. Years prior, Andrew Carnegie had put Henry Clay Frick in charge of his Carnegie Steel. Frick had overseen the massacre at Morewood in the previous year. In April of 1892, the Amalgamated Association had been collectively bargaining with Frick for a new union contract. Carnegie and Frick soon came to an agreement that the Amalgamated Association had too much power in Homestead, and if no agreement was reached, they would cease to recognize the union. On June 29th, Frick commenced a lockout of the workers. He built fences topped with barbed wire around the plant, installed watchtowers with searchlights and manned by armed guards, also placing high-pressure water cannons at each entrance capable of spraying boiling hot water. This was named by the union members Fort Frick. The next day, a meeting of the AA declared that the company had violated the contract by locking out workers the day before it had expired. They also gained the support of the Knights of Labor, who had organized the lower-skilled workers at the plant. Now, a strike began. The Carnegie Company now began the process of hiring strikebreakers, going so far as to advertise in Europe. The union began organizing the prevention of these strikebreakers from accessing the plant. A riverboat was used to patrol the river, next to which the plant was located. Men stood outside the plant, with more patrolling the train stations and roads of the town. Strangers who couldn't explain their visits to the town were escorted out. with reporters given special identification badges in order to pass through the town. Communication was kept with surrounding AA organizations who had also gone on strike out of sympathy with the Homestead strikers. When Frick ordered the Allegheny County Sheriff to intervene, the strikers held the picket line, putting the sheriff's deputies on their riverboat and sending them to Pittsburgh. Frick by this time had hired large numbers of Pinkerton agents, devising a plan to get them into the plant. In the late hours of July 5th, 300 Pinkerton detective agents assembled at the Davis Island Dam, about 15 miles upriver from Homestead, were armed with Winchester rifles, boarded on barges, and set off for the plant. Strikers, who had been aware of this movement for some time, began preparing as well, sending their small fleet of boats to intercept them. The strikers fired a few warning shots past the barges, though to no effect. As the barges continued, they soon arrived at the plant. Pinkerton agents began landing on the banks of the Ohio River and fired into the crowd, wounding striking steelworker William Foy. Seeing this, the strikers fired back, with a firefight ensuing. The riverboat which had towed the barges retreated back to Pittsburgh, leaving them stranded. A cannon was then retrieved from the town and brought up on the opposite side of the river, attempting to sink the barges, though most of the fire from the cannon was ineffective at this point. A barricade was set up on the shore above the barges by the strikers, who had now constructed a fairly solid position. At 8 a.m. on July 6th, the Pinkertons attempted to land again, but were repulsed. Steelworkers from Pittsburgh also began moving towards Homestead, seeking to support the strikers in their defense. As the violence continued, the AA hurriedly requested the county sheriff to organize a meeting between themselves and Henry Frick, but Frick refused, knowing that further violence would lead to the governor of Pennsylvania calling out the National Guard and ending the strike. However, the governor refused 2 requests for state militia. Eventually, the president of the AA, William Weehee, attempted to negotiate a peace, but the strikers would not agree to his terms. Instead, they came to their own terms, that the Pinkertons involved would be charged with murder, disarmed, and expelled from the town. The Pinkertons agreed, and soon surrendered. Escorted through the town to the train station, they were sent to the town's opera house in order to serve as a temporary jail, as terms to hand them over to the sheriff were sorted out. Eventually it was, and at 12:30 a.m. on July 7th, Pinkertons were sent by train to Pittsburgh. Although, upon arrival in the city, state officials declared the Pinkertons would not be charged with murder, and they were quickly whisked away in the early morning. That same day, National Guardsmen arrived in the city. Strikers, who believed that they were there to support them, attempted to welcome them, but the militia met them with hostility, breaking their picket lines and escorting owners and strikebreakers into the plant. The American Federation of Labor organized picket lines at Carnegie Company recruiting station, attempting to stop the flow of strikebreakers, but this was unsuccessful. When strikers attempted to stop the furnaces from being relit, the militia charged them with bayonets, wounding 6. However, tensions and violence between black and white strikebreakers limited the production of the plant over this time. In the days following, the AA simply requested that the company reopen negotiations, but Frick denied it. Days later, New York resident Alexander Berkman traveled to the Pittsburgh area, gained access to Frick's office, and shot and stabbed him. Despite this, Frick survived, and Berkman was arrested. By this time, the plant was back at full working capacity with strikebreakers, and the AA was near bankrupt. As the strike ground to a close, the union agreed to return to work with a pay reduction. Both sides attempted to press charges on one another. The union's attempts were completely ignored, while most of the strikers who were arrested were acquitted or released. However, Hugh Dempsey, Knights of Labor organizer, was convicted of attempting to poison strikebreakers despite the prosecution's only witness recanting a statement while under oath. He would serve 7 years in prison. Overall, 7 Homestead strikers would be killed and 11 wounded, with about the same on the side of the Pinkertons. Future unionization efforts in Homestead would be squashed by Carnegie Steel, with the plant being shut down in 1899 in order to avoid unionization. By 1900, not a single steel plant in Pennsylvania was unionized due to anti-union efforts by the Carnegie Company. Pullman, Illinois began as a company town in the 1880s, organized by George Pullman, owner of the Pullman Palace Car Company. Located just outside of Chicago, it was designed to keep employees under the control of the company, with each inhabitant owing rent. Following the Long Depression of 1893, standards of living dropped significantly in the neighborhood. The Pullman Company lowered wages in 1893, though they kept rent at the previous rate. Because of this, employees went on strike beginning on May 11, 1894. Many of the strikers joined the American Railway Union, whose president was Eugene V. Debs. The ARU soon organized a nationwide boycott of Pullman cars, its members refusing to move any train which contained Pullman-made rail cars. 125,000 workers across the United States soon walked off the job, refusing to haul Pullman cars. The Pullman Company brought in strikebreakers, mostly black people, in an attempt to incite violence towards them, though this did not occur. On June 29th, the railway workers derailed a locomotive and burned railroad property in Illinois. The federal government, lobbied by railroad officials, soon intervened. U.S. Attorney General Richard Olney, who was also on retainer to the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, received an injunction from 2 circuit justices, both who were openly anti-union, which ordered strikers across the U.S. to return to work, and the leaders of the ARU to stop encouraging them to do so. Debs and the ARU refused and called on union members to hold a picket line against the U.S. Army, who had now been dispatched to enforce the court orders. Across the U.S., the Army violently broke picket lines and forced through trains. 30 strikers were killed and an untold number wounded. As the press began reporting it, nativism was used to oppose the strikes, characterizing them as foreigners who weren't patriotic enough. After the strike was crushed by the federal government, Debs and the other officials of the ARU were prosecuted for violating court injunctions and conspiracy to obstruct the mail. Though acquitted of conspiracy, Debs was convicted of violating court injunctions and served 7 months in federal prison. Labor conflict in the coal fields of Pennsylvania hadn't ceased since the 1870s. Throughout these conflicts, Slavic labor from Eastern Europe had been imported as strikebreakers. As the United Mine Workers spread throughout Pennsylvania, many Slavic miners had not joined because of tensions between themselves and the English-speaking union members, both because of their cultural differences and their original job as strikebreakers. In 1897, the Lehigh and Wilkes-Barre Coal Company had laid off workers, lowered wages, and raised prices in the company towns. They also moved company mule stables, which forced teenage mule drivers to drive much farther each day, with no increase in pay. About 30 teenagers went on strike, though when a supervisor attempted to beat a boy in order to break a picket line, 2,000 mine workers struck out of solidarity, mostly joining the UMW. When the owner of the mines attempted to use Slavs as strikebreakers, they instead joined the strike and the UMW. Seeing this, the company negotiated a pay increase with the union. They agreed, and the strike ended. However, when the pay increases were announced, the raises were only given to a select few workers, leading to 3,000 UMW workers going on strike on September 3, 1897. When the company realized their coal and iron police would not be enough to put down the strike, they called on the Luzerne County Sheriff, James Martin, to form a posse. He did, composed of 100 men armed with Winchester rifles. The strike soon expanded to nearly 9,000 in number. On the morning of September 10, 1897, 400 striking workers, mostly Slavs and Germans, left from the town of Harwood, which was southwest of Hazleton, to march to the town of Latimer, northeast of Hazleton, in order to support a new UMW post which was about to go on strike. They were completely unarmed and marched with 2 American flags at their front. Stephen Urich, the man holding one of the flags, had enthusiastically joined the march, saying, quote, "We have nothing to worry about because we have the American flag to protect us." Upon reaching Hazleton, they were confronted by the sheriff's posse. Sheriff Martin stepped up to meet them, raising a piece of paper, saying their demonstration was against the law. He never read what was on the paper, but arrested 2 of the miners, injured several, and confiscated one of the flags. But the police chief of Hazleton agreed that they could continue if they stayed outside the city limits of Hazleton. As the marches continued around Hazleton, the sheriff's posse was heard saying things such as, quote, "I bet I drop 6 of them when I get over there," and, quote, "Let them go until we get to Latimer, and then we will shoot them down." The coal and iron police also joined the posse after the initial confrontation. Just outside of Latimer, the crowd of Slavs was confronted by Sheriff Martin and his posse, who were lined up on a slight rise of ground. After a moment of hesitation and inward consultation, the miners continued down the road. As the miners made a right turn onto Latimer Road, the posse moved to block them. They formed a half circle, with Sheriff Martin waiting under a tree nearby. With his pistol drawn, the unarmed miners approached Martin. When Martin demanded them to stop and go back, the miners argued they had the right to peacefully march. When somebody from the second rank of the group said, quote, "Go on," Sheriff Martin responded, quote, "Who said go on?" and grabbed the man by the collar. Anthony Devaney attempted to explain to the sheriff that they were there legally, though Sheriff Martin grabbed him and threw him to the side of the road. He attempted to seize the flag from Stephen Urich, who resisted. As the scuffle was escalated by Martin, he raised his pistol and attempted to shoot Stephen, though his revolver misfired. He then shouted, "Fire!" and the sheriff's deputies and Colon Iron police began firing into the unarmed, peaceful crowd. Stephen Urich was the first to be shot, falling into the nearby ditch, groaning, quote, "My God, that is enough," in his native Slovak before dying. As the strikers realized the posse was not firing blanks, they turned and ran, some attempting to seek refuge behind the nearby schoolhouse, others diving into the ditch, with others simply fleeing across the neighboring field. In order to shoot many of the fleeing strikers, the deputies had to run to the top of a trolley berm, clearly showing their enthusiasm and intent in the murders. Out of 19 killed, it was found that 14 of them had been shot in the back. About 50 more were permanently maimed. In the immediate aftermath, Sheriff Martin gave conflicting reports of what had transpired, and had reportedly first admitted to giving the order to fire. The massacre rallied even more strikers to the cause, and public sympathy lay mostly with the strikers. Huge crowds attended the funerals of the killed. As some strikers wavered in the following days, women of the surrounding area held the picket lines and held many scabs from returning to work. Nicknamed the Amazons after the famous Greek warrior women, many news articles were written about them. Led by Mary Septak, whose son had died as a result of black lung, they were advanced on by National Guardsmen who had been sent to break the strike. They retreated, but the strike eventually succeeded, and wages were increased by 10%. Though some sympathized with the strikers, many blamed them simply for not being American, arguing that because they weren't Anglo-Saxons, they were not human. The New York Times described how, quote, "the lives of the sheriff and his deputies were in danger," and, quote, "they brought death upon themselves." Though local newspapers condemned the posse, larger national ones blamed the strikers for their death. Martin and 73 of his deputies were arrested. During the trial, more gruesome details came out. One man, Marion Lacher, told how he witnessed deputies kick a man, Andrew Mayer, as he was spread out in pain on the Latimer Road, his right leg shattered by their bullets. Another, Angelo Matz, described how he saw a man shot in the back and fall into a culvert, wounded, only for a deputy to run up to him and fire into the defenseless man's back 3 times. Testimony from a medical professional identified that at least 33 of the wounded had been shot while fleeing. Sheriff Martin, simultaneously denying that he ordered the posse to fire and also justifying his actions, told how the, quote, "enraged foreigners were unable to reason and they were similar to animals." Despite all of this, all 74 defendants were found innocent. As the Western Federation of Miners found its footing in the waning years of the 1800s, victories in Colorado had strengthened its membership. It had also quickly become one of the most militant and radical of any union in the United States. Although briefly a member of the AFL, they left only after a year in 1897, as they felt the AFL had not adequately supported them. As a result, they had created the Western Labor Union, designed to be an all-encompassing union for workers of the Western United States. The leadership of the WFM and WLU believed in industrial unionism, which means that entire industries should be organized under a single union. The opposing belief, craft unions, believed that certain crafts or certain jobs should be unionized together. Also in the late 1800s, the National Association of Manufacturers was founded. Expressly created to oppose organized labor, its annual meeting in 1903 was attended by James C. Craig, president of the newly created Citizens Alliance of Denver. Despite its name, it was actually an organization made to fight unionism, its members being the largest companies and richest individuals of Colorado. This was followed by a rise in other, similar organizations, such as the Citizens Protective League, which is expressly to defend the interests of capital. The WFM and the Citizens Alliance were not the only forces acting in Colorado. Police, both private and government, had been suppressing unionism since it had come to Colorado. The Denver office of the Pinkerton Detective Agency was run by James McParland, the same Pinkerton who had infiltrated and had executed the Molly Maguires in Pennsylvania 25 years prior. Also in its workforce was Charles Sorinjo, the spy who had infiltrated the unions around Coeur d'Alene. The WFM had been fighting for the 8-hour workday for years, and had nearly gotten legislation passed that mandated it. though it was ruled unconstitutional by the Colorado Supreme Court. When they attempted to amend the Colorado Constitution with a referendum, 72% of the population supported it. However, the state legislature, paid off by mine companies, refused to pass it. Colorado Governor James Peabody had the opportunity to override this refusal, but he declined. With all this background, WFM miners in Idaho Springs, Colorado, struck for an 8-hour workday in May of 1903. As the strike was being suppressed by the mine owners, and years of horrible conditions had pent up, the miners blew up the mine's powerhouse. Using this as an excuse to round up union members, even those not involved in the bombing, the Citizens Protective League ordered police to arrest many individuals whom they felt threatened their business interests. 23 of these individuals were expelled from the town on order of the CPL. When this was declared illegal, they returned, though 8 of them were quickly arrested, again on order of the CPL, and charged with the bombing of the powerhouse, though they were all acquitted. The same judge who had declared their expulsion illegal then issued bench warrants for many of the members of the CPL, but the district attorney, who had cooperated with the CPL in the expulsions, refused to enforce them. Other strikes in the subsequent months had begun raising tensions in the state. Mine owners hired strikebreakers and Pinkerton detectives to infiltrate unions. They fired union workers expressly because they were members. Concentrated mostly in Colorado City, the National Guard was soon sent to the area by request of W.R. Gilbert, the sheriff. In his letter to the governor, he stated outright that it was in order to protect the interests of the rich and to break the strikes in the town. National Guardsmen forcibly broke picket lines, performed raids on suspected union members' homes, and escorted strikebreakers into work. The governor appointed key leaders of companies who had been targeted by strikers to important jobs within the state's National Guard. In the town of Cripple Creek, the WFM had requested mines to cease sending ore to the mills in Colorado City, threatening a strike at any mine doing so. However, 12 mines continued selling, so they went on strike. The governor, upon hearing this, requested upgraded weapons in preparation for a larger scale strike. However, these ended with some success, with the hiring back of fired union members and wage increases for workers at 2 of the mills. Though, as promises to not discriminate against union men were not kept, miners at the Colorado City ore mills went back to striking. Again, the WFM also struck at the surrounding mines as well, hoping to put more pressure on the mills. At this, local businessmen created the Cripple Creek Citizens Alliance in order to break strikes and continue making money. Sheriff's deputies' salaries were paid by the companies and continued to attempt to circumvent the strikes. Famous labor organizer Mother Jones was initially banned from the state of Colorado by Governor Peabody, but she had managed to slip in anyways. After some hesitation by the governor, the National Guard was sent out, now to Cripple Creek, but only after the Cripple Creek Mine Owners Association agreed to pay for them. With these private soldiers, the companies broke picket lines and continued their house-to-house raids. General Sherman Bell, in command of the Guardsmen, said things such as, quote, "I came to do up this damned anarchistic federation." He imprisoned anyone who spoke in favor of the strike, threatened news outlets who had covered it, and was incredibly brutal to people in the area in general. When a hearing was held for a few of the arrested miners, he stated, quote, "Habeas corpus be damned, we'll give him post-mortems." He saw the union busting and strike breaking as a military campaign, stating his tactics were out of, quote, "military necessity, which recognizes no laws, either civil or social." Bell was being paid more money annually by the Mine Owners Association than he had been by the state government. The upgraded weapons Peabody had requested during the previous strike were also delivered and distributed to Bell's men. Strikebreakers from out of state who had not been informed of the strike were forced at bayonet point to work by the soldiers. Some, such as Emil Peterson, tried to run. A lieutenant of the Colorado National Guard fired at him as he ran, narrowly missing. A warrant for the lieutenant was never enforced. One night, a train driver named Rush had stopped his train at the beginning of a bridge. He walked up in front of his train and searched the tracks. He found spikes missing from a number of the rail ties and so reported it to the police. A union man, H. McKinley, was arrested, charged, and later confessed to pulling the spikes. If this were done successfully, it certainly would have resulted in a great loss of life, as the ravine the bridge was over was hundreds of feet deep. This is a clear example where the brutality of the unions was demonstrated. Except it wasn't. H. McKinley later came out and said he had been handed the confession while in jail, and in return he would be given a pardon, immunity, $1,000, and a ticket to anywhere in the world that he and his wife wanted. It was also noted that for a man arrested on attempted murder charges, McKinley spent an awfully large amount of his time outside of jail, and that he and his wife had inexplicably received brand new, expensive clothing, ones definitely outside the price range of a miner who had been living on strike relief for months. Many who testified at the trial told of how the Mine Owners Association detectives had pulled the spikes from the track. In fact, many reported seeing a detective and at least one other person doing work on the railroad tracks the night of the incident. One detective even admitted to having planned the entire operation. It was also found that many Union officials were on the train that was nearly derailed. Rush, the man who was driving the train that night, also testified that one detective, named Sterling, had previously asked him where the worst place for a derailment would be. When he answered at the beginning of the bridge near the ravine, Sterling told Rush to be careful of damaged track at that spot on that night, which is why Rush had stopped in the first place. Ultimately, the 3 miners other than McKinley who were tried were not found guilty. McKinley was fined $300 for perjury, but this fine was covered by the Mine Owners Association. The 3 detectives Sterling, Scott, and Beckman were never arrested. As the strikes continued through 1903, deputy sheriffs began charging arrested strikers with vagrancy, which made not having a job illegal. In order to escape the fines, strikers had to stay out of town, and as a result, off the picket lines, letting companies freely use strikebreakers. It was also later found out that military authorities, who were also led by and paid by company owners, would plan street fights in order to keep the National Guard deployed, which was on one hand made more money for people such as General Bell, but also kept the mines and mills union-free. In one instance, officers of the Colorado National Guard fired their pistols at an uninhabited mine office and blamed it on the WFM. Explosions at 2 mines and an accident at another were all blamed on the WFM, despite them having no access to the properties as they were guarded night and day by large numbers of National Guardsmen. It was rumored that a secretive group known as the Committee of 40, made up of the 40 most powerful employers in the area, had been planning false flag attacks on behalf of the Union throughout the strike. After an anti-Union gathering, led by the Mine Owners Association, turned violent, 50 WFM miners were forced to barricade themselves in their local union hall, as a company of guardsmen commanded by a mine manager besieged them. After an hour of gunfire, the miners surrendered in order to take the wounded to hospital. Afterwards, the WFM hall was looted and vandalized, as were most in the area that night. A surge of arrests followed, with the mine owners not letting any food reach the prisoners until the women's auxiliary of the WFM stuck food in. Throughout these strikes, many people were deported from Colorado because of their participation in strikes, only being allowed to stay if they renounced their union membership. Many refused to do so and were sent out of state, away from their families and home. The Colorado Labor Wars is one of the most flagrant examples of anti-union and anti-working class violence in United States history, as both sides viewed it as a class war. WFA leader Billy Haywood said the mine owners, quote, did not find the gold, they did not mine the gold, they did not mill the gold, but by some weird alchemy all the gold belonged to them. Governor Peabody described the conflict as an act of, quote, controlling the lawless classes. Peabody was thrown a great banquet after the events, where he was praised by railroad, gold, silver, and coal executives for his, quote, stand on law and order. In the early 20th century, the Colorado government wasn't only controlled by gold and silver executives, it was also controlled by coal executives. A share in the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company was bought by John D. Rockefeller in 1903 and subsequently gifted to his son, John Rockefeller Jr., as a birthday present. Immediately, health and safety standards in its operations plummeted, with death rates in its owned mines skyrocketing to over double the national average. Though the majority of shares on the company were bought by Jay Gould, Gould was forced to sell off lots of stock because of the panic of 1907. After his shares were transferred to the Rockefeller family, Rockefeller Jr. hired Lamont Bowers to manage the company, who ruined the standards even further. To keep the power of the coal company solid, every employee of the company was threatened with bodily harm if they did not vote the way the company wanted to vote. Even the company's mules were registered to vote, and did so, all with whatever candidate Bowers chose. Bowers also banned books from company towns that he said contained, quote, erroneous ideas, including books containing pro-labor attitudes, and even Charles Darwin's book on the origin of species. As suppression of their employees grew greater and greater, the CFNI spent more than $20,000 annually on private detectives to infiltrate unions. In today's money, over $600,000. The most notable detectives came from the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. The strike began in the late summer of 1913, with over 80% of miners walking off the job after the company refused to recognize their UMWA membership. As heavy rainstorms afflicted the area, over 20,000 people, strikers and their families, were evicted from company housing. The UMWA did their best to provide them with temporary tents to live in while the strike continued. Wellborn, the president of the CFNI, declared he would not negotiate with the strikers under any circumstances. Sheriffs deputized more than 60, with a majority of them being from out of state. Immediately, a deputized militia was set up, led by John Chase, who had played an incredibly crucial role in the detentions, deportations, and violence of the labor war of 1903. Up to 75 additional Baldwin Felts detectives were brought into the South Colorado coalfield, with all of them being deputized by the county sheriff, and most of them with experience in breaking strikes in West Virginia. These detectives, along with the militia, regularly beat and otherwise oppressed the strikers. On October 9, 1913, early in the afternoon, a striking miner named Mark Powell was shot while herding cattle near mine guards who had gone out to patrol the area. The guards claimed the gunfire had come from a third party, though the mine guards were the only known parties to have been in the same area as Powell at the time. While escorting wagons on the 24th of the same month, sheriff's deputies fired into a crowd of strikers, killing 3. The National Guard was mobilized on October 28th. They were welcomed by the strikers with a band who played pro-union songs, but when asked to turn over their weapons, the strikers only gave a few, plus a toy gun. Throughout the rest of the year, violence increased from both sides of the conflict. A few strike breakers were killed, and many strikers beaten. In January of 1914, Mother Jones, who had now come to Colorado in support of the strike, was imprisoned by the National Guard. Several times, strikers attempted to free her, but none succeeded, fought off by the National Guard. As the tent cities built by the UMWA continued, Baldwin Felts agents, supported by the National Guard, would drive around them in makeshift armored cars and keep the miners awake with shouts, searchlights, and occasional indiscriminate bullets, which on several occasions struck and killed people. This led to many of the tent colonists to dig cellars for their tents to take cover from Baldwin Felts agents. In the early spring of 1914, the state had run out of money to fund the National Guard's deployment, so they recalled them and created a special company called Troop A. They were formed out of mine guards, Baldwin Felts agents, and others who had been participating in the strike breaking. They were led by Lieutenant Carl Linderfeld, who had been a mine guard during the 1903 labor war, and, at the beginning of this strike, had used his command of a National Guard unit to help put down the strikes even before the guard was called by the governor. On April 20th, 1914, 3 members of Troop A approached one of the tent colonies just outside the town of Ludlow and requested to speak to Louis Tikas, the leader of the tent camp, about an individual they claimed was being held against his will. Tikas left to talk with them. While he did this, members of Troop A installed a machine gun overlooking the tent colony, with more gathering behind a railroad track. Seeing this, armed miners began flanking them using a ditch. Troop A detonated 2 bombs designed to alert the National Guard units in the surrounding area. These explosions caused the strikers to ready themselves for combat, but still held their fire. However, Troop A did not. They began firing into the tent colony with machine guns and rifles, with combat lasting the entire day. However, a passing freight train's operators parked on the tracks to shield the colony from fire, and many of the unarmed people, mostly women and children, fled from the tent city, though some remained hidden in the cellars they had previously dug. The National Guard made these train operators resume their journey. By this time, Louis Tikas had returned and was directing the defense of the tents. As daylight was fading, Troop A stormed the tent colony, shooting strikers who attempted to surrender and burning tents. In at least one instance, children suffocated in the cellar of a tent as it was burned and the entrance blocked. Tikas and 2 others were captured. Witnesses say Linderfelt personally beat a defenseless Tikas, breaking a rifle butt over his head. Linderfelt then executed the 2 other miners, made Tikas begin running, and shot him in the back. Their bodies were found placed next to the railroad in full view of passing trains. Linderfelt made them stay there for 3 days before Union members finally retrieved them. 21 citizens of the tent colony were killed, with many more injured. Among these were 11-year-old Frank Snyder, shot. The Valdez family lost 5 of their number, including 3-month-old Elvira, 8-year-old Alula, 7-year-old Mary, and 9-year-old Rudolph. One child of the Costa family was orphaned and lost both of his siblings, his parents Carolina and Charles, killed, along with 4-year-old Lucy and 6-year-old Onofrio. The Petrucci family lost all of their 4 children, the youngest being just 6 months old, just a few days older than the strike. All of them burned alive or shot by Troop A of the Colorado National Guard. Outraged by these murders, strikers across the South Colorado coalfield took up arms. National Guardsmen were redeployed to the area as 2 pieces of modern artillery were brought along. On the 27th of April, National Guardsmen moved to take the town of Walsenburg. Occupied by strikers, a 2-day battle was fought over the town, though the Guardsmen eventually drove back the strikers. The next day, a force of 300 attacked the Forbes mine. Though initially repelled by a machine gun provided by the National Guards of the company, the strikers soon took the mine and burned it. By this time, President Woodrow Wilson had sent federal troops to stop the violence, though when they arrived, they only disarmed the miners. In total, 54 people died throughout the 10-day war. A federally negotiated peace treaty was agreed to by the strikers, but flatly denied by the mine owners. The strike continued into December of 1914, but as the UMWA began running out of funds to support it, it finally collapsed. Linderfelt would be tried and found guilty of the assault on Louis Tikas, though the court attached no criminality to his actions. Rockefeller Jr. would hire one of the first PR professionals and would take an awfully insensitive and inappropriately cheerful tour of his holdings in Colorado the year later. The man he hired, Ivy Lee, would go on to manage public relations for the Nazi German company IG Farben, which was responsible for making the poison gas widely used in the Holocaust. During the turn of the century, the Industrial Workers of the World was founded. Created in response to the American Federation of Labor, its major grievances included the AFL's refusal to organize unskilled laborers, its acceptance of capitalism, and its organization of craft unions rather than industrial, or in the IWW's case, general unions. Founded on the motto, quote, "An injury to one is an injury to all," the IWW sought to represent every worker in every country and every workplace. 2 of its most notable members include Frank Little and Joe Hill. Frank Little joined the union in its first year and rose through the ranks to sit on its executive board. In 1917, he traveled to Butte, Montana to organize a strike of miners in the Anaconda Copper Company. Recovering from a broken ankle and 2 hernias sustained in 2 different beatings, Little was abducted from his hotel room, beaten, dragged behind a car, and, while still alive, hung from a railroad trestle. Nobody was ever charged with the crime, though many suspected a man named Billy Oates, who had a hook for an arm after it was amputated, and who was a known thug hired by Anaconda Copper. This is because of a small, perfectly round hole in the back of Little's head. His funeral was attended by nearly 4,000 people. Joe Hill's fame came mostly through his song. He wrote many songs for the IWW, many were parodies of already existing songs.
Come on, do your share, lend a hand. There is power in a band, working folks when we stand hand in hand.
Live on, hey, you'll get by in the sky when you die, that's all right.
Come organize your might, then we'll sing.
He was a union organizer who traveled across the U.S., much like Frank Little. He was born in Sweden, but moved to the United States with his brother at the age of 23. Becoming a laborer, he worked in multiple cities from East Coast to West. One day, while in Salt Lake City, Utah, he was arrested on the charge that he had shot retired police officer and his son. Joe Hill had visited a doctor for a gunshot wound to the torso that same night. He claimed that he was shot during an argument over a woman and had had his hands in the air when he was shot. A comparison between the bullet hole in his coat and the exit wound in his back confirmed this. The doctor who treated him said he had a gun at the time, though proof this gun ever existed is scarce. Hill also had absolutely no familiarity with the victims, so there was no motive either. Despite all of this, Joe Hill was found guilty and executed by firing squad on November 19, 1915. In 1919, in the wake of World War I's extremely high production levels, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, the same union involved in the Homestead Strike, attempted to unionize the steel industry. Steel executives saw the expanding unionization and decided to crack down on it. However, this led to an industry-wide strike. As the strike spread, particularly in western Pennsylvania, so did the anti-labor violence. Although strikers were nearly entirely peaceful, the Pennsylvania State Police indiscriminately beat and arrested strikers, and carried out raids on suspected union members' homes. This anti-labor action was unsurprising, as the PSP was born out of the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Police, and the entire system of state policing was based on Pennsylvania's demonstration. Executives played on two major facets in order to sway public opinion. The first was the post-World War I Red Scare. The second was a nativist one, where they played on the racism and xenophobia of the time, pointing out how a large proportion of steelworkers were immigrants. The companies also spread false news stories, detailing how in other parts of the U.S. the strike had flatly failed. As strike-breaking and anti-strike violence continued, and the months slowly dragged onward, and hearing news that other locations had failed, the strike collapsed. 2 years later, in the West Virginia counties of Mingo and Logan, the UMWA was beginning a unionization push. While the northern coalfields had been unionized for some time, the southern coalfields of West Virginia remained unknown to the UMWA until in 1912, miners in the areas of Paint Creek and Cabin Creek attempted to unionize, leading to conflict with the mine bosses and their hired Baldwin-Felts detectives, ending in a new, miner-friendly contract being negotiated. However, what would occur in 1920 and 21 would be much larger than the Cabin Creek War ever got. As unionization pushes began in Mingo County, employers began firing unionized workers and evicting them from company housing. The company hired Baldwin-Felts detectives to do so. The police chief of Matawan, Sid Hatfield, and the mayor, Cable Testerman, uniformly sided with the miners, as Hatfield had grown up a coal miner himself. As Baldwin-Felts agents were carrying out evictions on May 19, 1920, Hatfield attempted to stop them. These detectives then told Hatfield that they had a warrant for his arrest and handed it to the mayor. The mayor responded, saying the warrant was bogus. However, the Baldwin-Felts attempted to arrest Hatfield anyways, and Mayor Testerman tried to stop them. Albert Felts, one of the Felts brothers, shot the mayor. Miners from around Matawan had previously gathered with arms in order to stop the evictions, so when Testerman was killed, a shootout between the miners and Sid Hatfield and the Baldwin-Felts agents commenced. The Baldwin-Felts agents were driven off, leaving 7 of their own dead with 2 miners and the mayor dead. In the aftermath, Sid Hatfield would go on to testify in Congress and was put on trial for the murders of the 7 Baldwin-Felts agents, including 2 of the Felts brothers, but was acquitted. Angered by this, the remaining Felts brother, Tom, sent more agents to Mingo. As Hatfield climbed the steps of the McDowell County Courthouse on trial for the sabotage of a coal loading station, 2 Baldwin-Felts agents gunned down Sid Hatfield and his friend Ed Chambers. Knowing these murders would not be prosecuted by the company-controlled West Virginia justice system, miners from across Appalachia, including other coal states such as Kentucky and Pennsylvania, traveled to Logan County to extract revenge and unionize them by force. These forces donned red handkerchiefs to identify themselves, regarded as the original source of the word redneck. Logan County Sheriff Don Chafin, supremely pro-capital and anti-labor, organized a 3,000-strong militia, heavily armed and funded by the coal companies, to repel the over 10,000-strong miners. Many of the militia were made up of mine guards, National Guardsmen, and West Virginia State Police. They entrenched themselves on the Guyan Ridge, which overlooked the eastern edge of Logan County. Skirmishes broke out beginning on August 25th, but a majority of the miners were still far away, and many were agreeing to turn home after negotiations with the federal government. However, knowing this, Chafin sent a group of militia to the town of Sharples, where they attacked and killed a group of Union miners. Hearing of this, the angry workers went to deal with Chafin's anti-Union army. Fighting was fierce, as all around, the miners attempted to break through the militia's positions, though most were unsuccessful. Chafin had hired private planes to drop gas and shrapnel bombs on the miners, and had acquired several mounted machine guns. Using these, they killed over 100 miners. In a few days, federal forces arrived, including multiple B-1 bombers. Most being veterans of World War I, the miners refused to fire on army units, and many hid their guns in the woods in order to stop them from being confiscated. In the trials that followed, nearly 1,000 miners were charged with murder and treason, and many were sentenced to prison. None of the 3,000 militiamen were even arrested. Although it was the largest, the Battle of Blair Mountain was not the last. Labor movements continue to this day, as does violence against it. These dates, these deaths, and these fights deserve recognition. They won the working class every single standard that exists today. Although still not yet completed, the battle towards a fair and equal world is built on the bodies of men and women, murdered by executives and companies, fighting for the rights of humanity.
Where will I go when I don't want to be with idle hands awaiting catastrophe? Here in the Anthropocene. Here. How will we escape this hell? How will we escape this hell? Is it a park? Is it a plaza? Where do I need to be? Is it a pipeline? Is it some refinery? The change ain't coming down from above. No sooner hold office than a Molotov. How will we escape this hell we made? How will we escape this hell? Pick your poison and pick your pride. Soon there'll be nowhere left to hide. The soil is cleaner than money.